Hello, U.S. history. We are back. We are going to pick up the sectionalism on the road to Civil War Google Slides presentation, and we're going to cover part 2. We left off with the Missouri Compromise of 1820 with Henry Clay saying, okay, let's have a one-for-one deal. Let's have Missouri be a slave state. We'll create Maine out of Massachusetts. That'll be a free state. And then everything north of 3630, parallel line in the Louisiana Purchase will be free, and everything south will be slave. So this is kind of a band-aid with solving the problem of Civil War, specifically because a lot of Southern slave owners really wanted to expand slavery. And one way that they looked at doing that was removing some of the Native Americans. We have 5 civilized tribes that the American government had made treaties with over time. The Creeks, the Seminoles, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, and the Cherokee. And when Andrew Jackson becomes president, he says, you know what, let's get some of that land. And that's mainly because a lot of Southerners had wanted that land, specifically to expand their plantations. So these Native Americans lived on the land that settlers wanted to expand their farms or their plantations. Jackson and Congress together, so we have the legislative branch and the executive branch coming together, and they both agree, you know what, let's remove these Native Americans from these 5 civilized tribes, mainly in Florida and in Georgia, but also some tribes in South Carolina. Let's remove them and we'll put them in Indian territory. We'll give them Oklahoma, and that was Indian territory. And this act eventually led to the Trail of Tears. However, there's going to be a little bit of a pause on the Indian Removal Act. And the pause is going to be a Supreme Court case known as Worcester versus Georgia. And in this case, in 1831, Samuel Worcester goes into Georgia. Him as well as some other non-Native Americans. They go into Cherokee Nation. So one thing to understand is that when the American government made treaties with these Native American tribes, they became their own nations. So I want you to really know that these Native American reservations weren't just reservations, it was specifically their own nation. It was their own country. So Georgia had created a law that said non-Native Americans cannot go into Cherokee Nation. And if you think back to the proclamation line of 1763, there is this idea that white settlers shouldn't be going into Native American territory because that could start war, that could start conflict. And so this was Georgia's attempt to say, hey, this is their own nation, leave it be. Georgia indicted or found guilty Samuel Worcester and said, hey, you broke the law, you went into Cherokee Nation, that's not okay. This eventually gets taken to the Supreme Court. And in a majority decision, you have Chief Justice John Marshall that says, well, hold on now. The Cherokee Nation is their own nation. Georgia has no right to arrest Samuel Worcester because that's the Cherokee Nation's decision to arrest him and his friends. Georgia has no legal standing in Cherokee Nation. Now, what this means, why is this important, and how this relates to the Trail of Tears. Chief Justice John Marshall, in the deciding opinion, wrote, the Cherokee Nation then is a distinct community occupying its own territory. Again, reaffirming this idea that this is a sovereign nation. The Cherokee are sovereign, in which the laws of Georgia can have no force, right? I can't arrest somebody in France. Even if I'm a police officer in America, I can't arrest somebody in France. Like, I have no jurisdiction there. France, they're their own sovereign nation. The whole intercourse between the United States and this nation is by our Constitution and laws vested in the government of the United States. So that's John Marshall saying, hey, they're their own territory, they're their own nation, we have no standing there. So in theory, this should put the ending on the Trail of Tears. This should prevent Andrew Jackson and his Congress from enforcing the Indian Removal Act. However, it does not. And this is kind of a constitutional crisis because we have a legislative branch that creates the laws. We have an executive branch that enforces the laws. And then because of Marbury versus Madison, think sectionalism, part 1 video lecture, the Supreme Court has the power of judicial review. The Supreme Court says this is constitutional, great. this is not stop. So in this case of Worcester v. Georgia, or Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, you have the Supreme Court saying, no, we have to end the Trail of Tears. And Andrew Jackson, his response is, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. So what do you do then? What do you do when the person who is supposed to enforce the laws say, nope, I'm not going to enforce that? What ends up happening is the Trail of Tears. And when he decides to, I'll cover Andrew Jackson right here, when Andrew Jackson decides to continue on with the Trail of Tears, he says, it gives me pleasure to announce to Congress that benevolent policy of government steadily pursued for nearly 30 years in relation to the removal of the Indians beyond the white settlement is approaching a happy consummation. So if we just look here at tone, he says, it gives me pleasure. He says benevolent, meaning good. This benevolent policy of the government, right, is approaching a happy consummation. So what we have here when it comes to this thinking question, this tone that Andrew Jackson takes when it comes to removing the Native Americans is happy, it's joyful. He calls this a benevolent policy. Now, if you were a Native American, you're probably not thinking that this is too much of a benevolent policy, the forcing removal of you and your people from your own nation to Oklahoma. And the Trail of Tears ultimately resulted in, a march of 12,000 miles, 100,000 Native Americans were forcibly removed, 15,000 died along the way, with 6,000 troops overseeing this removal. So the question you have to ask yourself is, if you're one of these 6,000 troops and you're overseeing the Trail of Tears, at what point are you thinking this is wrong? People are dropping dead. These are old people, these are babies, these are children. At what point do we need to stop this? And at this point, it's clearly not constitutional. The Supreme Court has said it's not, and the executive branch is saying, no, I am not going to follow this. Again, if we think about the central question about, is the Civil War a foregone conclusion, you can't have specific branches of the government saying, no, I'm not going to follow that law. This kind of relates to the Virginia to Kentucky resolution saying, hey, we're not going to follow federal law. Oregon, we continue to go through Oregon. We have an Oregon Trail that leads us from Kansas City, Missouri. So I want you to get this idea that we are constantly expanding in this period of the 1800s. 2,000 miles from Missouri to Oregon, 6-month wagon trip. Look at all of the supplies that you are needed in order to make this trek. And this is a difficult trek. So this is something that would take a lot of money to save up, a lot of willpower, but this is part of America's manifest destiny at this point. If you look at this journal entry from Margaret Frank, 1850, we started at 6 o'clock, forded Thomas Fork, and turning to the west came to a high steep spur that extends to the river. Over this high spur we were compelled to climb. Part of the way I rode on horseback and the rest I walked. The descent was very long and steep. So think, how do you get this wagon with all of these horses and these people down a really steep descent in order to forge ahead? All the wheels of the wagon were tied fast and it slid along the ground. At one place, the men held it back with ropes and let it down slowly. After coming to the valley, we drove to the river and rested some time for dinner. In the afternoon, we went 7 miles further down the valley and encamped at sundown by a beautiful stream. So here we have, when it comes to this journey, it's incredibly expensive, it's incredibly difficult, it's incredibly time consuming, and you really need a sense of community to help you out. And this is important because when America grows its territory from sea to sea, there is this sense of entitlement. Like, this is my land. It took me forever and a day and difficulty to get to this land. Texas. So again, we keep expanding, and one area we expand is Texas. Now, the Mexicans had won a war against Spain, and after they won the war against Spain, they invited Americans to come into this territory called Tejas. They said, Americans, come into this territory, become Mexican, become Catholic, do not bring your slaves, and we'll all be good. And Mexico did this because they need bodies to fill the land. If they have bodies to fill the land, they're less likely to have another invasion, an invasion either by America or by Spain. Americans from the South see this as additional slave territory. Oh my goodness, this is in the South. We can just come and bring our slaves. Now, of course, again, the Mexican government said, no slaves, become Catholic, become Mexican. All Americans in the South heard was, land, come in, Americans, and that's what they did. They flooded the land so much that by 1835, the land in a de facto squatters' rights kind of way became Texas. It became part of America. And the Texans fought the Mexican government several times between 1835 and 1836 in order to gain their own sovereignty or independence from Mexico. Now, they end up, through a series of attacks, winning this area of Tejas and transforming it into Texas. During that period, the Texans say, hey, can we become part of the United States, right? We need American military, we need American money, we need American protection so that we can become a state and we don't have to worry about an invasion by Mexico. We can hold on to this territory. At this time, many Americans in Congress, many people in Congress said, no, like, I'm not hearing you, I'm not listening to you, because this was too much of a hot topic. If it became annexed, it would be a slave state. And then it would be seen by a lot of Northerners of this slave power conspiracy, this conspiracy to just accumulate states, accumulate territory, invade foreign nations, kind of like with Native Americans, and then just take land in order to spread slavery. So they tabled that discussion. And from 1836 until 1845, Congress said, no, like we're not going to discuss this. We have this gag rule actually in Congress that I'll get to later that said we're not going to discuss slavery. We're not going to talk about it, and we'll just kind of ignore Texas, which is why it became what's known as the Lone Star State. However, you have President James K. Polk at this time, and James K. Polk is a fervent expansionist. He gets elected saying 5440 or fight to claim a ton of territory in Oregon. And we end up getting not 5440, but we end up getting a huge chunk of the Oregon territory without a fight, making a deal with the British. But when it comes to this territory, James K. Polk had sent in troops around the Rio Grande, and that kind of became the border between Texas and Mexico. Basically, this militia, this American army, was a little bit pugnacious, pointing guns, towards the Mexican border, towards the Mexican side, and really trying to itch for a war. And a lot of historians have basically claimed that this is, James K. Polk's kind of drumming up to kind of start a war in order to get Texas to become a state, in order to make an excuse to have it become additional territory. And when Mexico ended up fighting back, James K. Polk asks Congress to declare war and says, Mexico has passed the boundary, right, that's that Rio Grande, of the United States, has invaded our territory and shed American blood upon American soil. And so just so you can have a map for context, that's Alta California, so that is Mexican territory right there. There is Nuevo Mexico, and then here's kind of this border right now that we're talking about, and you can kind of see it, like right there. So this is essentially what we're fighting over when it comes to the Mexican-American War. Now, there was a ton of protests against the Mexican-American War, mainly from the North, of course, who saw this as part of this slave power conspiracy. You accumulate more states, you accumulate more electoral votes, you accumulate more power in Congress. So here's a young Abraham Lincoln serving in the House of Representatives in Illinois, saying, after all of this, President Polk gives us a long message without showing us that, as to the end, he himself has even an imaginary conception, saying, President Polk he started this war and he has no exit strategy. Like, what is this plan? He knows not where he is. He is a bewildered, confounded, and miserably perplexed man. So here we have, Abraham Lincoln offering like a really stern congressional dig against James K. Polk. We also had people petition Congress, peace petition to Congress of the United States, 1847. The undersigned, entitled to vote in Trumbull County, Ohio, feeling exceedingly grieved and ashamed that such a war should be waged or sustained by this republic as one against Mexico, right? So again, there's these questions here about, why was this war even happening? Why did it occur? Saying that without regard to party, to use all the influence you may possess to have said war cease. So even if you're a Whig or a Democrat, doesn't matter. We need to end this war as soon as possible so that we can maintain our honor. And if you please, we should be glad to have Mexico receive reparation. Right? So not only should we stop this war to end all bloodshed right now, but we should stop this war and we should say sorry and we should pay Mexico. We end up ending the war. We pay Mexico $15 million, and we get that territory of Alta California and Nuevo Mexico. We get Texas, and this is in perfect time because once we pay Mexico $15 million, that's all said and done. The war is over. We have the California Gold Rush of 1849. Gold is discovered in 1848. In Sutter's Fort, kind of around Sacramento in the Central Valley, and then you have this mad rush of people from all over the United States rushing to strike it rich. Now, most people, of course, did not strike it rich, but this leads to boom towns overnight in California, boom towns on the roads developed to California for people stopping along the way. And this also is our first influx of a lot of Asians, specifically Chinese, coming across the Pacific and landing in California to strike it rich. So let's watch America grow. So here you have from 1791, 1792, that Northwest Territory is from the French and Indian War. Territories become more organized and they become states. We get the Louisiana Purchase with Thomas Jefferson. It becomes official. States qualify for statehood when they have a constitution and they reach a certain population. We have the Missouri Compromise made. Mexico wins its war against Spain. There you have the Republic of Texas and disputed territory between Mexico and Texas. But you can see, the big gray area on the Pacific side is Mexico. We gain Texas. Mexico gives us that unorganized territory. And you can see slowly but surely all of this unorganized territory gets to be carved out by states by 1861. Then we have the Civil War. Now the Civil War is over. We get Alaska. Territory slowly fades away with states becoming states. Hawaii becomes a territory. And there we have Alaska and Hawaii become states. So now we're going to transition from political differences and westward expansion to economic differences. And the central question here is how economic developments led to regional developments. So the first thing we're going to talk about is this, I'll put myself right here for right now, is the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution marked a period of development in the latter half of the 18th century that transformed largely rural agrarian societies in Europe and America into industrialized urban ones. And in this case, we're really focusing on the North. So why? The War of 1812, fought between the British and the Americans, limited America's ability to import manufactured goods. We also couldn't make a ton of manufactured goods. And this made America realize that we were too dependent on England to have manufactured goods. And that's really not okay, especially during a war. So we become more developed. One thing that really led this development is the Constitution itself. Article 1, Section 8 Clause 8 of the U.S. Constitution reviews the patent and copyright clause to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors exclusive right to their respective writings and discovery. Basically, what that means is if you want to invent something and bring it to America, great. We will reward you with money. And this is one thing that really spurs a lot of development in America, from 1791 until present day. This concept that you can become an inventor, you can have exclusive rights over your invention, and make some money off of this. So let's look at some of these inventions. So we're first going to start with the steam engine, which was developed by James Watt in 1788. Factories no longer had to be located near rivers. That's really good, specifically for the South, though a lot of the banking industry and already bones of factories and industry had already been located in the North. Interchangeable parts. This is really key. This was developed by Eli Whitney in 1798, and it was pre-manufactured identical parts for muskets. So before this time, to make guns, it was a real craft. They were really expensive, and now this allows us to have kind of a mass-produced market for guns, which is really going to help the North during the Civil War. The steamboat is invented by Robert Fulton in 1807, and this improved water transportation. So all of these pieces together really are laying this economic foundation of differences, because again, it really benefits the North. You have the steam locomotive in 1814, which eventually leads to the development of railroads. However, at this time, in 1814, you don't have standard gauges, so you have tracks that are laid, but they're not connected between the states or connected in large areas. It's also really expensive to build a railroad. John Deere creates the steel plow in 1833, which allows for faster, efficient farming. And we have the telegraph, which is developed by Samuel Morse in 1837. And this uses telegrams or short messages that you can write and transmit across time. So here we are basically shrinking time, we are shrinking space with the developments in transportation and communication. However, one of the most important inventions at this time by Eli Whitney in 1793 is the cotton gin. This made it 50 times more effective than picking cotton by hand. You pick cotton by hand and you have all these little seeds in the ball, and you have to kind of hand pick the seeds. So cotton's really expensive at this time. It can only be grown in certain climates, and the South is perfect for growing cotton. So once the cotton gin is invented, you can kind of pick all of the cotton balls, you kind of put them in this big hopper, here, you spin this crank, and then it is going to pick all of the seeds out. So the effects of this are incredibly important. It creates a cotton empire in the South. In the South, they call this King Cotton. It also, throughout the 1800s, increases the South's dependency on slave labor. There was this idea by the framers of the Constitution that slavery would just die a natural death. Right? We're not going to need it anymore. We're going to transition into small farms, and we'll have manufacturing. But with the cotton gin, it really kind of jumpstarts the dependency on slavery in the South, but also it allows for the growth of these textile mills in the North. Another important element to know when it comes to talking about the Industrial Revolution in America is Samuel Slater. Samuel Slater built the first spinning mill in Rhode Island. Now, he did this not with the most honest means. He stole the plans from England. He was an apprentice in Great Britain working in a factory, and it was, if you're working in this factory, you swear to these secrets. And he's like, I swear, just kidding. And he went over to America and brought these plans over to America, issued his own patent. He can make his own money. And this led to, New England becoming this haven for industry. And again, when you have cotton growing in large scale in the South and you have these textile mills in the North, you actually have this interdependence relationship happening at this time. So this is from Ron Chernow's Alexander Hamilton. He says, a young man named Samuel Slater slipped through the tight protective net thrown by the British authorities around their textile business. As a former apprentice, Slater had sworn that he would never reveal his boss's trade secrets. Flouting his pledge, he sailed to New York and made contact with Moses Brown, a Rhode Island Quaker. Under Slater's supervision, Brown financed a spinning mill in Rhode Island that replicated his boss's mill. Hamilton received detailed reports of this triumph, and pretty soon mill dams proliferated on New England's rivers. With patriotic pride, Brown predicted to Hamilton that mills and machines may be erected in different places in 1 year to make all the cotton yarn that may be wanted in the United States. So again, you have this scholarly analysis here talking about why it's so important, right? We're going to have mills and machines erected in different places in 1 year to make all the cotton yarn that may be wanted in the United States. Now, as far as really thinking deeply about this quote, this expands slavery. This really expands slavery. A lot of people think slavery was a unique Southern institution, but the North was reliant on the cotton that was being picked and produced in the South in order to grow all of these textile mills and turn us into a textile mill economy, specifically in the North. So if you look at the growth of cotton, here you have 1839. Each dot represents 4,000 bales of cotton. And then we have 1859. And this continues, 1889, even after slavery ended. 1919. And of course, 1924. Despite the fact that slavery does end, it's important to note that sharecropping remained, and we'll talk about sharecropping when we talk about Reconstruction. So life in the mill was not easy peasy. Here you have this primary letter from Mary Paul, a Lowell mill girl. Lowell in Massachusetts became a big factory town where young women would flock in order to work in a mill before they got married in order to earn some money. Dear Father, I received your letter on Thursday the 14th with much pleasure. I am well, which is one comfort. My life and health are spared while others are cut off. Last Thursday, one girl fell down and broke her neck. Oh no, which caused instant death. She was going in or coming out of the mill and slipped down, it being very icy. The same day, a man was killed by the rail cars. Another had nearly all of his ribs broken. Another was nearly killed by falling down and having a bale of cotton fall on him. Last Tuesday, we were paid. In all, I had $6.60. Paid $4.68 for board. Next payment, I am to have $1 a week beside my board. I think that the factory is the best place for me, and if any girl wants to employment, I advise them to come to Lowell. You might be thinking that this letter is incredibly disjointed, specifically because in the beginning, she talks about instant death, right? And slips down very icy. A man was killed. Another was nearly killed, right? And here she's paid, yay, but a huge chunk of that pay is taken out because of room and board. But it's really this independence. At this time, a lot of women did not have a ton of time to have independent lives outside of their home. And this is this first step of women going into this, outer sphere, as historians call it. So now we'll talk about social differences, specifically because as these women are going outside of their domestic sphere and working outside of the home, again, they're not working in male fields. They're working in a textile mill, so they're working with clothing, right? Or they're working in a chicken factory, so they're working with food. So they are still kind of like in their own domestic sphere, but they're earning their own money, and women are starting to develop some agency, which is really important because women, specifically these new middle-class women, are going to start to lead this charge against slavery. So the central question when it comes to understanding social differences is how the growth of regional social differences led to the Civil War. So let's first look at some different views on slavery. So Thomas Jefferson famously called slavery like grabbing a wolf by the ears. You grab a wolf by the ears and it's going to want to get free. But the second you free that wolf, it's going to come back and bite you. So you try to hold on to the wolf as much as possible. But the longer you hold on to the wolf, the more angry the wolf is going to get, and it's going to try to bite you, right? And so that, I think, is a perfect analogy because by 1800, slavery had been in the country since 1619. How do you get rid of it? You don't have a time machine, and you can't go back and say, this is a bad idea. So you have a lot of different views on how to end slavery. Now, of course, my personal opinion is, free all of the slaves and, give them some land, take some of that land from those plantation owners. But my opinion is not very important because I was not alive at this time. So one opinion is popular sovereignty, saying, hey, let the people in the states make their decision about slavery by voting. Now, this would seem ideal. This is very American, very Republican, right? Let's vote. However, do you think that at this time they would give slaves the right to vote about to end slavery or not? No. Another view we have is free soilers. Now, free soilers wanted to end slavery because they could not compete with the labor source. Now, when it came to popular sovereignty, that's really a democratic means of solving the problem. Free soilers looked at this from an economic problem. These are not white farmers who said, oh my gosh, slavery is so bad. These are white farmers that said, my wage is depressed because I can't compete with these plantation owners who have hundreds of slaves. So we need to free slavery so we can have a free market economy. That's what a free soiler was. Unfortunately, most people went with this, ignore the problem, right? This is like what we did with Texas. Let's not talk about slavery, let's not think about slavery, let's not annex any new territory, let's not make any decisions about slavery, because that's how we can have peace. Because if we have to make a decision about slavery, we're gonna go to war. And that actually was a true statement. You did have a fair number of abolitionists at this time, mainly located in the north, in New England area, but also in the middle area. Slave states expand their power through the 3/5 compromise. Slavery must end everywhere for social, economic, and political reasons, right? So it needs to end socially because it's just bad. It's inhumane. It's immoral. Economic because you don't have a free market, and political because the 3/5 compromise will always give slave states more power, specifically as slavery expands. Now here you have a picture from the AntiColonization Society, and this became a prominent organization in the North. And the idea behind colonization was that slaveholders gradually and voluntarily free their slaves and just send them back to Africa. And at this time, they would get sent to Liberia. Another view on ending slavery was, I'll move my slides right here, petitioners would lobby Congress to end slavery in the states or nationwide, right? And this was mainly led by women, middle-class New Englanders who would write and say, I signed my name, we have this anti-slavery convention, let's talk about ways to end slavery. Sometimes they would start newspapers, publish books, write speeches. So here we have the address of the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society from 1836. As immortal souls created by God, to know and love him with all our hearts and our neighbor as ourselves. We owe immediate obedience to his commands, respecting the sinful system of slavery, beneath which 2,500,000 of our fellow immortals, children of the same country, are crushed, soul and body, in the extremity of degradation and agony. As wives and mothers, as sisters and daughters, we are deeply responsible for the influence we have on the human race. We are bound to exert it. What's key here, also on a side note, is women don't have the right to vote. So just kind of keep that in mind. We are bound to urge them to regain, defend, and preserve and violate the rights of others, especially those whom they have most deeply wronged. We are bound to the constant exercise of the only right we ourselves enjoy, the right which our physical weakness renders peculiarly appropriate, the right of petition, right? Which is really making clear down here, we don't have the right to vote, but we can petition you, and that's what a fair amount of New England women do. Here you have one of the most famous abolitionist newspapers that was started by William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, right here and right here. And this would document the evils of slavery. And here you have this political cartoon, right? The Friends of Humanity laying the axe to the opus tree of slavery, which has all of the sins of villainy, adultery, treachery, lust, cruelty, suicide, death, brutality, vice, robbery, violence, right? So this newspaper, the whole goal was, let's spread this message against slavery. But there is no rush to end slavery. No rush. By the middle of the 19th century, there still isn't a large demand to end slavery. Remember, New England textile mills are benefiting off of all of the cotton that is grown in the South, and Southerners are largely benefiting off of all of the cotton that is being produced and then sold. So you have a fair number of Southerners who also don't own any slaves. And you might be wondering, well, why would they want to continue slavery? Well, one, it also expands their political power. Remember, the Three-Fifths Compromise expands their political power. There's also this idea of maybe one day I can own a slave. Right? That was the goal. It's so sick and sad, but that was the goal, right? I'm a capitalist, I'm a free market individual, one day I can own a slave. But that's, again, completely ignoring the fact that the people who owned 20 slaves and then through procreation now have 300 slaves, this economic field is not sustainable. Here you have a manifest of a slave ship from 1844. So slavery, the transatlantic slave trade ended in, I think it was 1803 or 1804, but you do have slaves being sold between the states. So let's take a closer look at this slave manifest. For the purpose of being sold or disposed of as slaves or to be held in service of labor. Again, the language, these people, slaves are not treated like they are people. They're numbered, they do have a name, their age is recorded, their height, whether they are Negro, mulatto, or a person of color, where they should be sent. So you have ages here, and look, you have the age of 5, age of 8, 10, 11, 14, 17, right? These are young children. And then at the bottom, it says, they are held in service as labor, as slaves, and are not entitled to freedom under these laws at a certain time and after a known period of service. So no, like these are not indentured servants, they are slaves, they are not to be freed after a certain amount of time, like done. And the slave market was very profitable as well. Right here you have list of a gang of 44 Negroes accustomed to the culture of cotton and provisions. Tuesday, the 8th, right? And then you have here qualifications. What do they do? You have ages. Again, look at this. Lucy is 9 years old. Mary is 3. Martha is 3. Right? Incredibly sad. Incredibly sad. And then here you have this person's notes with how much she wants to bid on these slaves. So again, just kind of further evidence that this is what I would expect to see if I was going to bid on a piece of art. Right? How much would I buy this for? What is my limit? What's the condition, but not a person, not a human being. So again, this is further evidence that slaves were not even thought of as human beings. Right, here you have Peter is 2, right? He's an infant. Rima is 3, and you can see how much they're being sold for. $385, right? Oh, this guy is, or this female is 40, $640. Oh, these two, Hetty and Rachel, they weren't sold. Oh, maybe I might want to take a look at them later. Houseboy, field hand, accomplished carpenter, driver, carpenter, field hand. Right? The slave market is very profitable business, so there isn't a rush to end slavery. Here you have a bill of sale for a slave. Again, Negro boy George is a slave for life. Again, 1833. How much is this person worth? This person's worth is $500 for their whole life. Tennessee, $500, boy, about 17 years old. So a lot of Southerners knew that this was not a very good institution. You have moral arguments that are made in favor of slavery. You have moral arguments made against slavery, political, economic, social, made in favor and against. But in order to make sure that we don't talk about this, there was a gag rule in Congress. In 1834, the American Anti-Slavery Society began a petition to end slavery. And by 1838, more than 130,000 abolitionists sent petitions to Congress requesting slavery end, right? And this is your right? The First Amendment gives you the right to petition. But in May of 1836, the House of Representatives passed a resolution saying, no, we have this gag rule, and it was further strengthened, between 1836 until it ended in 1844, which said, we are not going to discuss slavery, we're not going to discuss slave states, we're not going to discuss abolitionism, so you can petition all you want. That is your right, but we're going to take the petition and we're going to throw it in the trash. So you can tell that at this moment, we don't have a lot of democratic means of even really discussing slavery, at least in the federal government. John Quincy Adams was a member of Congress that really opposed the gag rule. And here he is, holding anti-slavery petitions, just kind of crouched on the floor. He's not able to do much about it. Whereas this Whig defender of slavery frowns at Adams and says, sir, the South loses caste whenever she suffers this subject to be discussed. It might be indignantly frowned upon. Meaning, oh no, we can own slaves, but we can't talk about it. And then here you have hiding Massa Du Bois, a Whig defender. He know how to scare him, meaning, this guy knows how to scare this guy. Because ultimately, who's winning with the gag resolution, right? It's the defender of slavery. And the other woman says, that Adams is flat down, right? He's given up. Although, this cartoon is not 100% accurate because Adams continues. He continues to fight and in order to end this gag rule. So this is where we leave off with sectionalism. We will pick up with the nation splits. So between 1850 and 1860, how do we eventually get to that point where the South says, no, we're going to secede? 7 states say, peace out, Abraham Lincoln. All right, thanks for listening. I hope this helps you with your notes. Bye, U.S. history students.